call this work session to order. Second work session on AO 2020-66, authorizing the acquisition by purchase or lease with option to purchase of real property. Let's go ahead and start with introductions.
Thanks, Alex. Suzanne LeBrance.
Pete Peterson.
Felix Rivera. Jason.
Jason Bockenstead.
Dean Geeks, Assembly Council.
And then on the phone, we have John Weddleton.
Here.
Crystal Kennedy.
Here.
Forrest Udbar.
Here.
Austin Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Cameron Perez Verdia.
Here.
Jamie Allard.
Here.
Christopher Constant.
Here.
All right. As usual, folks on the phone, feel free to text me to get into the queue. So this work session, we don't have any additional presentation or anything for this particular meeting. This is just a follow-up for us to have any questions answered, any further discussion or exploration before we take this item up on Tuesday. So we are going to go through a few recaps of some community meetings that happened this week, and then switch to open discussion. So with that, I am gonna go ahead. So we had two meetings. So we had a meeting by the Spenard Community Council regarding I think it was general regarding all of the properties, but I think there was somewhat of a focus on the America's Best Value. And then there was another meeting regarding the Golden Lion. So I'm going to go ahead and start with either Ms. Quinn Davidson or Mr. Perez Verdia, if you want to give a quick recap of the meeting that happened with the Spenard Community Council.
Go ahead, Cameron.
Okay. Well, I'm outside, so I'm going to try my best to not make too much. Let's see. I think that first of all, I want to thank Jason for a great presentation. It was comprehensive and really well done. Overall, it was a really good meeting. We had over 40 people who were on the Zoom call, and we had a number of great questions relating to operating costs and I guess I would say that there was a fair amount of support for it, but also just overall concern about the impact it's going to have on the neighborhood, the amount of foot traffic. Really trying to get a sense of what the operation is going to look like. I think that there's still not a lot of clarity about exactly how it's going to be set up and how it's going to be run. I would just say that I had probably 6 or 7 conversations after it with members in the community, and most of what I heard was that there was concern about the long-term sustainability, about the overall cost of it, and it really having a potentially negative effect on the surrounding environment. So that was most of what I heard. But I also heard a fair amount of support and people feeling like it was really needed, and that the opportunity to actually do some improvements in that area in terms of the physical structure and the environment. The one thing I wanted to sort of point out that I think the two people I talked to that they really appreciated was this idea of having transportation from that site to other places, so that there was an opportunity for people to actually come up, get information, but that wasn't something that they weren't going to be able to stay there that night. And there was a thinking that there was going to be transportation to other areas. I think that's probably all I have to share, but I'm guessing Austin is going to add some more. Go for it, Austin.
No, that's perfect. I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
Oh, no, it's okay. I'm good, thanks.
All right, thank you both. So the second meeting that was had was organized by Ms. Zolotel and I, inviting Rogers Park and Tudor area. So Ms. Zolotel, do you want to give a synopsis of that one?
Sure, thank you. you. It was very well attended. We had almost 100 participants, with about 10 of those being administration, and those myself. And we received a presentation, then we went to a Q&A. We had a lot of questions. We had already received some questions, so they were around the differences really between a treatment center versus a homeless shelter. Would this be actually a treatment center versus a homeless shelter? Would there be in and out at the facility? As many of you probably know, the intersection at Benson and New Seward is one that is not always the most pedestrian friendly. What would be the implications for the property given Midtown congestion relief and the proposed highway project there? What would the treatment center be like, both as to its operations, who would be served, how many individuals would be served? Would it be inpatient versus outpatient? What type of drug addiction? And really the response there is there's some guidance, but it's going to depend on the operator as the RFP is put out. And why there? Why there versus somewhere else? What happens to the idea of Clitheroe? Why is the Golden Lion actually a suitable physical structure building? Oh, and then clarification that, and I'm sure Jason probably will talk about this a little bit later, but that the ML&P proceeds will be used for that particular property's purchase, or is what's being proposed. And then concerns, just, I think we've all seen them in our email, but they were reiterated. What does it mean to put a treatment facility near a neighborhood, so that, do we know if there are known property value impacts or things like that? I think those are the highlights. We took up nearly an hour and a half with the questions and answers, and I'm still going back through the chat to make sure we caught them all. Very involved crowd.
All right, thank you. So now, basically the rest of the meeting we can do open discussion, but maybe before we do that, do you want to, Mr. Buckenstad, talk about the S version before we open it up to discussion?
Sure, absolutely. So there is an S version. It is one clarifying revision on there that is in regards to the source of funds. We were not as clear in the original version as we wanted to be, but we, as everyone in the body knows, one of the key parts of the ML&P transaction, the stipulated agreement that has been approved by the RCA, is that $15 million of the ML&P's remaining unrestricted cash needs to be designated towards an Alaska Center for Treatment. So we wanted to revise the ordinance and make it very clear that for this particular property, that is the source of funds that we are planning on using, and not CARES Act funds for this property.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go through the queue as I have it now. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thank you. So ending the last work session and moving into this one with a conversation about Mr. Weddleton's experience on the Planning and Zoning Commission 10 years ago, which of course brought up the emotional reaction in me as my experience as a member of the public and the president of the community council in which that project was located. And that time 10 years ago was when my personal campaign began to break up the concentration of social services from only being cited in the downtown, in particular around 3rd and Ingra. And so to that end, and the Assembly, thankfully, to Mr. Rivera and Ms. LaFrance, sponsored a resolution in 2018 that we should all have been provided. That is the stated policy of the municipality, that we work to distribute the social services across the community for homelessness support. And so we've heard tons of argument about no process and nobody knew this was coming. But I would like all the members to reread that resolution that's been provided to you and contemplate the meaning of it, because that is definitely the thoughtful, and I forget if it was unanimous. I think it's a unanimous support to the body that we implement this plan that we are now on the verge of moving forward with. And so, or at least I hope we are on Tuesday. So with that, I just want to again direct everyone to that resolution. This is our policy. It's been our stated policy for 2 years, and this project has been ongoing for a decade. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am overall really supportive of the acquisition. And Jason, when you say property, you mean all 4 properties would be acquired with that $15 million, correct? Or it would go toward the purchase of all 4 of those?
No, the $15 million would only be used for the Golden Line, the treatment center, because that is what is spelled out in the stipulated agreement on the MLP transaction. The remaining 3 properties would be CARES Act funds as was laid out in the original ordinance.
Can you, this wasn't even what my question was going to be, but now I have a new one. Could you tell me how much they each cost, and are we going to then have leftover money from the $15 million from the MLMP settlement?
So I'll answer the latter question first. Yes, we do believe that after the acquisition, that there will be a significant amount of money of that $15 million left to do any necessary renovations that will be required once we have gone out with an RFP and selected an operator and have brought them on to help us through that process. And then the remaining ones, I don't know the exact listing price for each of them, but part of what the process would look like if we received approval from the Assembly is Robin Ward, who was a real estate director, would then sit down with each of the property owners and negotiate a sale price that may or may not be what the list price is. I think it would look very similar to what any individual does when they're purchasing a home. They send different amounts back and forth until they reach a price that everyone agrees is fair.
Got it. And can I ask a follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
So I think I agree with this in concept. My issue is that we still haven't determined how we're going to fund which pieces. It sounds like you have some ideas, but I would like to see a spreadsheet or something that is far more descriptive, both the acquisition, and it can be rough numbers, and then beyond that, operating. Because, as you said, it's going to be about $7 million a year operating. If that comes out of the alcohol tax, that's a huge chunk of the alcohol tax, particularly in light of, crisis now models we're looking into, or prevention work. And we know if we don't do prevention work, we're just going to keep seeing this cycle over and over again. And so I know there's an MLNP dividend. You and I have talked about the possibilities, but to me, voting to buy these 4 properties and making a commitment to the community when we don't have a plan for how we're going to fund them specifically is irresponsible. And so I totally support the concept, but I think Tuesday with no details to me is far too early and not well thought out enough. And I don't mean to be critical of you independently or individually, but I think I need that information.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a question related to the last work session, and it might be that I'm just confused by some of what we're seeing in the many, many emails we're getting. But some folks in those emails seem to feel that at least 2 of these properties, for us to do what you propose here, we would have to pass AO 2020-58 so that we could do certain things in B3. But then, our last work session, the administration just recommended that we postpone it indefinitely. So can you explain that to me and whether or not I have a misconception there, and what the effect of, if any, that postponing indefinitely or voting down that other ordinance has on this one?
I believe Chris Schutte is still on the line, so I will likely let him answer that question more fully. But the answer is no. In the short run, that ordinance is not necessary for us to be able to operate any of the facilities because there are additional emergency powers that the Assembly, through their emergency overnight shelter ordinance, provided the administration in terms of being able to house folks in an overnight location. But I'll let Chris answer that in more detail.
Come on, God.
Thank you. So through the chair, Chris Schutte, Director of Economic and Community Development. I love it when Jason goes first because he'll give you the full answer and then hand it over to me. But let me just go through it on a property by property basis for Assemblymember Dunbar. We too have seen and heard a lot of confusion between the two ordinances that are currently on the agenda for Tuesday night, and a lot of individuals that are conflating the two. But I want to be absolutely clear that the uses that are proposed at the America's Best Value, at the Best Western Golden Lion, and the day shelter services proposed at the Alaska Club do not require any zoning change whatsoever. In fact, the treatment center proposed at the Golden Lion it does not require any zoning change. And if it was a private entity looking to do this, it would happen essentially with no public notice. It's an available option for that property as is today. No zoning code changes required. The interest in turning the Midtown Alaska Club into an overnight transient shelter, more akin to what Brother Francis provides or what Beans Cafe provides, that does require a zoning code change. But as Mr. Bockenstedt pointed out, in the interim, if we can establish that site as a emergency homeless shelter, it can start serving clients prior to completion of a B3 zoning ordinance. But in its current condition and its current zoning, you can turn it on tomorrow for the homeless day services.
Okay, can I ask a follow-up to that, Mr. Rivera?
Go ahead.
So I appreciate that. That's all very clarifying. Thank you. And particularly with the Golden Lion, I'm a little bit surprised by that, but thinking about it, that's interesting and makes sense over the long term. Chris, Mr. Schutte, what is the thinking for the Tudor property in terms of if we purchase it, how soon would we operationalize the day the day services versus the night services? And then, are we going to be in a set of circumstances where, unfortunately, I don't see the coronavirus subsiding anytime soon. It seems to be actually increasing in a lot of places. So because of that, the emergency also continues. But will there be in the work session you just gave to us, you put 6 to 9 months as the time frame for when we would have the appropriate process completed. And I'm for the other ordinance. And I'm just wondering, does that mean that we're going to hold off on doing those overnight services, or do you see those being phased in under the emergency powers and then potentially phased out until that other ordinance can be in place? Thank you, Mr. Rivera.
Through the chair, Chris Schutte again. Assemblymember Dunbar, I believe that given the current condition of the building and the need for various improvements to bring it up to current building code in order to allow overnight sleeping, overnight shelter, the intent would be to purchase the property and begin the renovation work, and if possible, activate it as the day services, day shelter as quickly as can be. And then concurrent with the zoning code changes that we described in the previous work session and concurrent with the building upgrades that would need to occur to accommodate overnight sheltering, the future timeline is a little more blurry. But in the hypothetical that you just laid out, it is possible for the day shelter services to activate immediately. And if the physical improvements to the site are done prior to completion on the zoning ordinance, then yes, it could be activated in an emergency basis temporarily until the zoning code catches up.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Gates?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask about the addition of using the MMP cash proceeds for purchasing the golden line that you suggested. And if I remember correctly, the stipulation of the parties to the RCA case, it said that cash would be used for the Alaska Center for Treatment. So is this still consistent with that stated purpose of the stipulation? And how is it consistent?
Through the chair, Mr. Gates, yes, we believe that it is consistent. There was never a actual location that was defined within the stipulation. It was simply the name that we gave the treatment center that would eventually open would be called the Alaska Center for Treatment.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. A few things. To Dean's point, there was a very concerted effort to not call it the Clitheroe Center. We called it the Alaska Center for Treatment, so we didn't predispose the operator or the operation. Also, to the question about shelter in B3, we have two emergency methods we can utilize if we purchase the building and find the need for those beds. And that is under the COVID emergency. And I believe Dean has already informed us at least twice that any land use Title 21 changes relative to the COVID emergency exist beyond the emergency for up to 2 years. So if we were to utilize that power to allow a temporary overnight shelter, then it would be able to operate for up to 2 years. Dean can correct me if I'm mistaken. Then we also have the emergency shelter provisions that we worked out this year that allow shelter to happen when we have need for beds. And so that's a separate power that we have on which arrangement can be made and these services could be delivered. The most important thing for the peace of our neighbors to understand about the use of the emergency power is that it doesn't create an entitlement, a right to have that operation there. And so their use is limited to that which is in the agreement, and they don't expand beyond that. And then finally, to Ms. Quinn Davidson's point, I appreciate the desire to have everything all at once in front of us so that we can make a perfect informed decision, but we don't have the luxury of perfect. We can work really hard towards good. And I believe that we're getting really close to having all that information. I do look forward to a spreadsheet coming forward that details out rough operations and rough expenditures per facility. But we shouldn't hold and wait until everything is just right, because if we do that, it will never happen. And every day that goes by that we don't move forward is a day we're not prepared. And then to the final point of the question of $7 million of alcohol tax, my hope is that we come up with a plan that front loads a substantial portion of the alcohol tax, which is maybe that's $7 million, into these operations with a declining investment over the next 5 years, that it goes down to a much less substantial amount as the operations move from emergency shelters into supportive housing, which has funding attached to it, especially to the 1115 Medicaid waiver and other elements that are coming onto line right now. And so I'm hopeful that we are going to be very aggressive about funding these services so we can make the societal transformation that our neighbors have been demanding. And so we don't allow the worst imaginings of the neighbors who these properties are nearby, as they have seen how we have done what we have done before. We need to do things differently, and we need to do it aggressively with the resources we have now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. I guess just one piece of guidance from me as the chair. A lot of these arguments are getting into things that we should probably wait for at the assembly meeting on Tuesday, which is when we deliberate this item. But let's keep going. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to bring up the fact that one of the reasons for the S version is there's a bit of a strategy here, and I will show my cards and say that for me, I cannot, and I know you don't want to really debate this, but I don't support all of the projects on this list. And so in order to maybe support one or two of them, I wanted to see the items specifically delineated, and that's what the S version does, is it puts each one of them as its own item. So you see A, B, C, D under section 1. So that allows us to have some flexibility in how we look at these particular properties and how we even have a conversation about what to support. So anyway, I guess I won't say more than that until Tuesday night, but just wanted to explain that there's some rationale behind trying to kind of bifurcate this in a certain way. I guess it would be the best way to say it. So anyway, that's why you see the items specifically itemized. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. LaFranks?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I had wanted to also bring up the issue of the business cases. Austin, Ms. Quinn Davidson said about understanding the OpEx costs for each program, each property. And I understand that we're not creating any, you can't know all the information necessarily ahead of time, but it would be very helpful to me to understand risks too of what happens if we can't execute these programs and end up with the properties. So that's one area. And then I also actually was interested in bifurcating and identifying or looking at each property individually. So I'm that's coming next. In the S version. I haven't seen it yet. So, or wait, has it been distributed on email? I think it's updated.
I believe it has.
Has been. Okay.
Thank you. Ms. Zalata?
Thanks. Actually, I think there's going to be two different S versions. So I'm not sure that we're, so I can just say I don't think the one that Mr. Bockenstead referred to is the same one as Ms. Kennedy is referring to. So the two different S versions. Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to make sure we have this conversation as we continue before Tuesday to that lease map we got in the last work session is actually really helpful. If you go and plot where Expedition and Clare House are, you'll find that they fall in traditionally B3 zones. So I just want to add that for some context. And then also remind everyone that we do have some money in our budget operationally for shelter that the Assembly chose to put in there at $730,000, plus what we have done in the past for cold weather over.
Sorry, Meg. Folks on the phone can't hear you very well.
Oh, sorry. I just was reminding us that we had also put money in the budget for shelter, both cold weather overnight or emergency dollars, plus the $730,000 we did to try to extend it into a full year. So I just wanted to put those things out there as facts that people can consider looking at the rest of the documents. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from Assembly members? And then I'll turn it to the administration to provide any other final comments. Any other questions?
Chair Christopher here.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Constant.
I got an email today about an item, and so this is kind of off topic, but I don't know, it kind of seems on topic too, from Catholic Social Services, and I couldn't make any sense about it, relating to some kind of a budget amendment, and I think it has to do with the money that Ms. Alatel was just referencing. And so I am wondering if anybody actually has any knowledge about that, because I believe it relates to this homeless service array that we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Schutte, do you want to talk about that, or Mr. Buckstad?
Sure. I think as it is an item that I believe is on the addendum, but it might already have been
It was on the regular agenda.
Was it on the regular agenda?
Yeah, it's item 10D10.
Okay. If members remember back to last year when there the state when we were dealing with some massive vetoes, and we declared an emergency to prevent the Brother Francis shelter from closing down. The Assembly authorized and appropriated $400,000 for the second half of last year and the first half of this year. The request that is before you in that item is for an additional $200,000 to cover the rest of this year for the Brother Francis shelter operations. So that's what that is.
Any follow-up, Mr. Constant? Okay, I'm not hearing anything. Mr. Weddleton?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I couldn't get unmuted. I'm just trying to figure out what it is they're doing now. If they're asking for the same amount of money but serving 1/4 as many people, I'm trying to wrap my head around what this does.
So I'm going to go ahead and allow this and maybe one other question on it, but this is not the item that we have scheduled and noticed for this meeting, so I feel we might be getting a little bit out of bounds. But go ahead if we want to answer this question.
Well, I'm certainly happy to follow up and provide additional details on this offline so that we don't get too far off.
Sure.
Sure.
We'll go ahead and do that.
I would just suggest that if it's going to come later, then this item should be delayed. I will probably be moving for a delay until we've been properly briefed on the topic.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotov.
That's fine. I'm good. So I guess if there needs to be context to the comment I made earlier about what funding we may or may not have in the budget around shelter. If someone could provide that clarification, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm just looking for the other S version that's out. Ms. Zolotel was referring to something other than I was referring to, and I've been looking for emails on that and haven't seen anything. So just wondering if we could get that resent or tell me where to look for it. That'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I have no clue either what this other S version means. Oh, sorry, Mr. Weddleton.
That's okay. Hey, thanks. So I, actually just emailed a long list of questions to Jason and Chris Schutte, and to you guys. You can just answer those via email if you prefer. But there's kind of a topic that hasn't really been touched on much here. Is as we set these up, so we have put out RFPs and people bid on them to run these things. And I just wonder if we are going to augment what is already being done, or if people will simply move their operations over to these facilities. So that, it's just kind of crowding out other nonprofits, or the work that nonprofits are doing elsewhere, and not really building capacity. So anyway, can you guys address that? Kristen.
Certainly, through the chair, Assemblymember Weddleton. Through this entire process, we have had conversations with different providers, both on the treatment side and also on the shelter and day engagement center side. And it has never been our intent to switch where certain services are being provided to these potential locations. We are all trying to do with each of these locations is add capacity, and that has been what we have relayed to all of the providers that we have had conversations with, and I believe that has been fully understood by them.
But it leads to the question: if we do something like a mental health facility, if you need a psychiatrist or to train people master's degrees and whatever it is, are those people available? I mean, we have this need all across the country, and they're very expensive. Are we able to hire people to operate these things, or not? Maybe not us, but even nonprofits.
So through the chair, this is Chris Schutte, let me take first stab at that and just point out that we are talking about an outcome, but the item in front of us is a real estate transaction. And so one way to think about that question, Assemblymember Weddleton, is we are proposing to purchase the vehicle through which services can be provided. I do not believe that it sets up an environment where we will displace existing service providers, but we are creating the capacity for service providers, whether existing or new, to increase the service delivery to a population that clearly is in demand.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Yeah, thanks. Mr. Weddleton, just that I intimated this before, but I'll be more specific. With the implementation of Medicaid reform and the expansion, the state has agreed to provide funding for services heretofore that they have never been willing to do. Through the 1115 waiver, which there are two of them, one for substance abuse or substance misuse disorders, and one for behavioral health, mental health services. And so we are at a crux in time when the state has provided a vehicle to fund those critical positions like clinicians who provide those expensive services that providers have never been able to afford before. And so as I understand it from my friends at DBH, there's a simple model that can help any of these organizations become successful, and that's to hire a clinician, a biller, and an IT person. And then you can afford to hire any number of staff, and they are available if you can pay for them. So that's my experience in the field to answer that question.
Thank you.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. Did you want to add anything else, or any other members of the administration?
I do just want to make one final comment, because it has come up a couple of different times about the operating dollars that we have presented and where we believe the ongoing amount will come from. And I just want to make clear, we have never proposed and will not be proposing that all $7 million of these potential operating costs need to come from the alcohol tax. But if you look back to presentations that the administration has given before, we have said about $4.5 million of the alcohol tax revenue should go towards the operating of a treatment center and additional homelessness facilities. So that number, at least the $4.5 million number, should not come as a surprise to anyone, because we have talked about that very publicly before. The remaining amount of money will come from a number of different areas. Again, as part of the CARES Act, we have been also very successful in receiving additional federal grants, both in the ESG, and that's the Emergency Services Grant Program, and CDBG, additional money that is specifically earmarked for operating of either overnight shelters or daytime engagement centers. And while that money is not long-term money, it is money that we have available now and can use for the next couple of years. So that is another bucket. The third bucket is, as everyone should also be aware, our philanthropic partners are very interested in providing us support on the operating side for some of these services. So some of that will be provided by them. And then the final bucket that I have talked about is as a result of the RCA now fully conditionally approving the MLP transaction, there will be a very, very large deposit of $230 million into the municipal trust fund that will spin off somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 to $12 million every single year that can be earmarked for this as well. So I just wanted to make it very clear that the administration has never said that we want to take $7 million of the alcohol tax and put it towards this. It will be a combination of each of those buckets that I have described to make sure that we are fully funding these operating costs. Because again, as I think I said at the last work session, if we can't, make sure that we have annual operating dollars for these, so that we're successful in actually operating these, then I don't know what we're doing. We shouldn't, members shouldn't support purchasing these unless we're all willing to commit to making sure that they are fully funded and being able to operate year in and year out.
Thank you. And did anyone else from on the phone from the administration want to give final comments? All right, I'm not hearing anyone else on the phone. Okay, so I think we have one final quick question from Mr. Weddleton.
Quick, I thought we had till 4. I got 17 minutes.
Well, I like being a
So I'll try to talk fast. So Jason, just on your point that money spun off from MLMP money going into the trust fund could be dedicated to this. I suppose it could, but in our budget for this year, we have already assumed all that money into the budget and essentially allocated it to the general fund for all the variety of things we've done. So when we look at 2021, if we were to take that money and put it towards this or some amount of it, that would mean cuts elsewhere in the budget. Isn't that right?
Through the chair, Assemblymember Weddleton, no, not necessarily, because the entire point of us creating a municipal trust fund is that it would grow over time, and also as it's growing, it is spinning off additional revenue each year. And I should just mention, because of the other buckets that we have, it is somewhat unlikely, at least in the early years, that we would actually have to access any of that revenue, because as I mentioned, we've gotten additional CARES money through the ESG grants and the CDBG grants that are allowable, or we have a number of years to spend those. So our hope would be that every year the trust continues to grow and spins off additional revenue.
Me too.
All right, thank you. All right, not seeing anything else. Thank you so much.